Like we said, we started doing this at this gala back in 2015, and we've done it a couple times since then in different places, and we are interested in continuing to work on it, so we'd really appreciate any kind of questions or comments you might have, feedback. Are there any questions?
Anything. Okay.
That's your cues, gone.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is really it.
This is really the
your
Q&A.
Speak.
Are there sparks in here between you guys?
The gentleman with the glasses over there in the corner.
Hi. What's your name?
Oscar.
Hi, Oscar.
Hello.
What was your question?
Are there actual sparks in the air with you guys?
Are there actual sparks in the air between us?
Dynamic.
Well, I hope so. We're doing a performance, and one of the goals of a performance, as I've understood it in some of my training, is for the performance to create sparks. So, yes, I would say yes.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Yes, the lady here in the flowered skirt.
Hi. Do you mind if I sit down? What's your name?
My name's Star.
Hi, Star.
I kind of have two questions. I'm wondering if you've considered to kind of change the roles, because it feels like you're more antagonistic, like you're more of an antagonistic, and I like really dislike you, you know, and so I'm just seeing like, especially understanding politics in like third world countries and like post-colonialism and being from having family from a third world country, I'm wondering, is there any way to kind of change the role, and is that what it's meant to be, is to kind of these preconceived like racial stereotypes of like, you know, brown people are like this man, they putting these like, you know, patriarchal shit on women. And like you guys are doing this performance and at the gala, is it meant to do that in future performances? Is there any way to then change those roles, or is it pretty set because of those, like, you know, racist norms and what we think about that? And yeah, and is it met on those preconceived notions? You know, is that why it's so, you know, is it, you know, is that when you're coming out and you're so strong and, you know, theorists and all that, is it set on that notion, you know, on trying to achieve that social norm of the intellectual academic? And yeah, so that's a lot of what I was wondering about.
Wow. The figure at the podium at the beginning is definitely meant to embody the kind of disembodied authority of the academic voice, which presumes, especially if you talk about the field of South Asian studies historically, which presumes a kind of white protagonist, shall we say, who has access to the esoteric knowledge of the exotic other. With respect to the relationships between the two individuals, the relationships have changed. We've done different things at different moments in time. One thing that actually is interesting to us is the ways in which people respond with like and dislike for specific figures. And some people voice a real sense of discomfort. Some people get kind of caught up in the campy humor of the piece. So yeah, because it's something that we're continuing to work, we continue to explore the relationships. And it's sort of a piece where the text is saying the vachika is saying one thing, but then there are other moments when abhinaya, other elements are communicating something differently. So that's sort of, we're trying to get multiple layers. But we've also, in this present day, we've changed the costuming. And I think that has also given, changing the aharya, gave a different sense of who the two characters are, in a way that I wasn't wearing this full. This is actually, by the way, not a full Bharatanatyam costume. There are other elements, but this is sort of an abbreviated version of that. So, yeah, these are good questions. I don't think it's a performance that seeks to resolve those things. We feel uncomfortable with it, and so that sort of troubling sense of discomfort that the audience has is, I think, something we wanted to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Oh, the gentleman here in the glasses next to the camera.
Hi. What's your name?
Seymour.
Hi, Seymour.
Thank you for coming today. I guess my question is similar or along the same lines as Star's question, where I guess one of the reasons why I said to the moon as a response was because something I was thinking about was this sort of heterosexual power dynamic that's seen in sort of these Western sitcom theaters that I felt you were evoking. And I guess I'm not extremely familiar with sort of Eastern theater techniques, and I was wondering if you were, how you were dealing with those and why you're bringing those up.
Well, there's a couple of questions there. Why are we well, because I think there's an issue. There's several things we address. There are issues between gender, masculine and feminine, and we certainly upend. I'm definitely not a white hegemonic man, but I am a hegemonic guy, and which is why I think Star had an issue, which we kind of like. What was the second part of your question? It was, the Eastern techniques. What was that about?
Yeah, well, it's something, at least the performance was evoking Eastern theater techniques, and I was wondering if that was, if there were parts of that I might not be familiar with that you were also invoking. I guess it just made me feel uncomfortable as well, the heterosexual power dynamics.
Right, right. Well, the piece is about Indian theater, and Indian theater's relation to subaltern practice and post-colonialism, and also theatrical practice in general, as we went on to say. So many of those confusions that you might have felt are questions, as Shanti said earlier, issues that we have as well. And in a way, we want to ask the audience those questions as well. I can't speak for you, but I would say that the discomfort that you may have felt at not knowing what we were talking about, that's okay. That's a kind of a bridge to kind of gap in terms of not understanding the
Oh, sorry, I was just uncomfortable with like the portrayed sexual violence.
Oh, yeah.
Many people have commented that.
Yeah.
It wasn't the content.
Yeah.
And actually, we feel glad about that.
Yes.
Because if someone wasn't uncomfortable
Right.
with the sexual
It'd be a
violence,
problem.
then it would be a problem for us, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
There's a woman here with a brown jacket on.
Yes,
We know
there
her, so.
is. Yes, there is. Sorry.
Hi. I'd like you to talk more about the relationship between the kind of gender, sexuality, ethnicity nexus and then the embodiment of knowledge. Because I think what, to me, made this piece so brilliant the first time I saw it was, in a way, it seems quite blatant, but then it's also quite subtle the way the piece enacts a problematic of disembodied versus embodied knowledge in relation to that nexus. So could you talk more about that?
Well, this is the hardest part of the piece, really. These questions. Okay, well, first of all, there's this whole question of the ways in which literary knowledge or text-based knowledge occupies a superior status to embodied forms of knowledge, the ways then which the study of dramatic literature or theater occupy a superior position supposedly with respect to something, say, like dance studies, complicated all the more in the context of South Asian and even Asian studies of performance generally, since we don't operate from this kind of firewall distinction between dance and theater. It's natyam in this context, which encompasses multiple modes of performance music and even the visual arts as well. So that sense of the embodied and the disembodied, or word and the corporeal, is different in the tradition. But then when that comes to be represented in the academy, in the context of the political structures of the academy, right, and the sort of feminized labor of junior faculty members, the exotified image that certain ethnicities who are junior faculty members come to represent for everyone in the department. It also shapes the ways in which people perceive what the person does, what constitutes the kind of knowledge that person has and the relevance of that knowledge to other things that take place or other kinds of academic conversations. So I think all of that is what we're trying to bring up, because, and I'm not answering this very well just off the top of my head, but sometimes it's kind of surprising, because when you're down in the middle of stuff, and of course the everyday in an academic department we know is just like, barely get through your classes and grading and all that, but these things are present, and you and I are very aware of these things, but it's amazing how invisible these kinds of dynamics are. And so to have some platform to portray those things in a kind of campy way that really draws from multiple performance traditions, right? Is, I think, what we're attempting to do. That didn't answer your question, but I'm gonna go back up. Are there any other questions we can fail to answer? Yes, at the back by the door.
That's nice.
Hi, what's your name?
Patrice.
Hi, Patrice.
Hi. One, I just want to thank the both of you. Super incredible, and I feel like I'm going to be chewing on this for a bit. I have a technical question. I want to know how much of what you all are doing is improv and how much is already choreographed. Especially the sort of like transition between the thing that I felt was choreographed and then you're like, now the Q&A, and then all of a sudden we were in another piece again. And I was like, wait a second, where? And it took a minute, even when you're like, it's the Q&A, I was like, are you sure? Even though I still feel like we're in a performance right now. So I'm just wondering how much of what you all are doing is choreographed, how much is it improv?
It's been interesting to me that as the questions have gone on, they answered themselves. Well, I think you guys have figured out by now it's not that hard to figure out. And thank you for enjoying the piece. That one of the big things that we're playing with, obviously, is performativity. and where does performance end, and where does real life begin, and what does that really matter, and who decides, and all of those questions. So we have been embodying that in the piece. And one of the ways that we've specifically done that is move between improvisation, seeming improvisation, a lecture that is a lecture that doesn't make sense as a lecture, but does make sense as a lecture. And so one of the is to force our audience to actually sort of, one of the things you always want to do is be ahead of the audience.
Yeah.
And many times in the things that we're confronted with, and today, our audiences are right in step or actually in front. And so it's very difficult because we're not that good. We're kind of just okay, and we're working on it. We're trying to stay ahead, and that's sort of so that actually the biggest thing that we're playing with is actually that, is moving in between those modes of performativity and what that actually means and how you catch up with that, and then the information, which is actually can be dense, can be off-putting, can be humorous, and can be everything at the same time in a time. I'll stop there.
Also, this sense of the kind of semi-permeable membrane between codification and the everyday or stylization and quotidianness, and between performer and character. Those are all very deep principles of the Indian theatrical practices, the Indian theatrical tradition. This fluid sort of way that performers kind of morph in and out between a real formality and then a very free sense of informality, between high choreography and improvisation. Improvisation is one of the hallmarks of the Indian performance practices.
Are there any other questions? Yes. There's a person here with glasses and a
There are a lot of people with glasses.
she has a check on her shirt and she's wearing red shoes in the front row.
Yes. Your name, please?
Nora.
I'm Nora.
I have a question which is a little unformed still,
Hi, Anthony.
and it's about honesty. And so the way maybe I can approach it is my personal reaction. And so in the course of the piece, I'm interested and I understand the lecture mostly, and then once you start to dance, I understand that and I feel that there's a strength there and there's a certain, I guess I'm feeling it as like, okay, these are traditional forms that I know, and there's a certain honesty in the deliverance of it, and then once you're shifting between things and you start to blend the borders and perform a critique of these forms, I start to get more uncomfortable and I think, okay, this is criticism, and what I need or what I want is honesty and force, which I feel come in through the classical disciplines that you're doing somehow and don't come in through, or at least for me, this more like a boundary criticism of shifting between, of performing a fake lecture or, So I am just stating it from my lived experience of the piece, and I don't know if honesty is the right term. It's probably the wrong term.
I don't think it's a question of right or wrong. This is something that we talk about a lot. In the Indian performance tradition, this term honesty or authenticity is not used. It's irrelevant. But I hear that term a lot in the like performance studies / theater / dance context that I've operated in institutions here in the United States. And I think it has a kind of moral and perhaps even religious in some ways set of assumptions, this terminology of honesty, that I actually feel uncomfortable with. What is truth? Who has the right to declare what truth is and what truth is not, right? What is honest or sincere for one person is not for another. And India, and I would say, traditionally speaking, of course, you know, modern world is different, so we're speaking in these kind of very broad generalizations. Things are much more complex. But in Asian society, traditionally, everyday life is understood to be highly performative. There's not a singular, clearly delineated sense of a self, especially in the Indian tradition, right? The self has many faces. And what that self is different in different contexts. So sometimes self is a sister, sometimes self is a wife, sometimes is a daughter, sometimes is a co-worker. And all of those roles, those characterizations, require a different set of behaviors and ways of thinking about self and others. So that everyday life is already highly performative. So this sense of like, who am I, or what is the fundamental truth, those are very, very philosophical, transcendent kind of questions. And they're not ones that anyone answers from our common everyday level of consciousness, right? So first of all, I would say that. So I'm thrilled all the more that you have this sense, because I think that's one of the things that we're playing with, of why is it that people outside of these forms and practices perceive them to be somehow honest or authentic when the practitioners themselves and the typical audiences for these practices don't have that as a rubric or a measure of what's going on. It's kind of, it's not a consideration at all. So again, I think it also gets back to this sense of discomfort that occurs in the viewer, and so I'm really glad that you said that, because I hadn't heard that expressed in quite the same way, and that's something I think we can think about and as we continue to work on the piece and develop it. I'm sure we'll talk about it tomorrow in your class, right? Yeah, thank you.
One of the things that Shanti talked about earlier was the fact that the costume she wore today is different than what we've used in the past. And when we were thinking about doing it with this, there's a particular charge that the audience gets by seeing this. And so there's a reason for that. To state it directly, there are, and as I say actually in the lecture, right, there are non-Western forms that ineluctably belong to the latter, these traditional forms, which some people say are authentic, or some people say are honest. They're more, and in fact, they're only ever used, as I say, to measure and affirm the West as emblematic of modernity. In fact, when we think of them as being honest and real, what we're actually doing is putting in the context of, as I was saying about the ape in a report to the Academy, that the people who looked at him used him as a way to measure and affirm their worlds. So the charge that you get already puts you in a place of like, this is important. This is
or sacred, or I don't have an opinion that I can
real.
Say something about it. And the interesting thing was the previous costume was actually this interesting haute couture black silk dress that was created by an Italian designer who was imitating Issey Miyake. There's a lot of like things going on there. I liked it because somehow the architecture of the dress reminded me in some ways in its relation to the body of the Kathakali performer, but it was not at all a traditional item, and consistently people thought that it was, which was really interesting to observe. And secondly, last thing I'll say is that actually none of the choreography is traditional that's being done here. But of course, naturally it reads that way. No surprises, right? Yes?
What happens?
No, sorry.
You broke form.
Hi, I'm Lan.
Hi.
So I'm wondering, this this whole thing is premised on an audience that is predominantly white in the university in the United States, UK, and would have probably less knowledge or of even like South Asian studies, for instance. So because South Asian studies, the people you're invoking, really, I mean, Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak, Dipesh Chakravarti. So there are South Asians in dissent who used and manipulated the idiom of like high theory and broke into the American Academy in a very powerful way, when no one else who was brown or black was being listened to as being as smart as the white people. Okay? So that's a different thing than the older South Asian studies, which was all the white anthropologists with their wives, concubines, whatever, who did the translation and all that stuff.
You seem to know the world well.
Yeah. So two things about that. So then what happens when you have an audience, or has this happened for you, that you have an audience of South Asian studies people, or you have an audience of I could imagine in the United States, South Asian Americans who are training or have had experience with Bharatanatyam or Kathak or one of the dance forms. What happens for their response? Have you had that experience, and what's happened?
I don't think we have had, no, I'm sorry. No, forgive me. At UCLA, we had that experience.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
right.
at UCLA.
At World Arts and Cultures?
Exactly.
Oh, gosh. How did that go?
Interestingly enough, the conversation there, like here, was also followed by a graduate seminar, revolved more around the sexual violence, the politics of gender in the piece, than it did these kinds of considerations.
Okay.
I think that's a really good question. There are some kinds of guesses I could make, maybe if it were a place where you had a lot of South Asian undergraduate students who have grown up, you know, going to their dance class, and you know, sort of high caste, very diasporic culture of their natal household. I could see where this sort of thing might be very new to them. It would be off-putting to them for another set of reasons, right? Because they're not used to, first of all, I think that the diasporic community is very, very tied to a sanctified, Hinduized, Hindutva-fied vision of the classical arts and of Indian culture. So to see that as being, first of all, as being contemporary and as being a language of kind of political critique, shall we say, would be very, very unfamiliar. And I think, I'm just guessing, right? I mean, I don't mean to say that they would be fools or something, I'm not saying that, but I think it would defy their set of, their points of reference. And in some ways it would be interesting to see what happened,
yeah, because
and
what kind of satire will they pick up?
Yeah. We have possibility of doing it, meaning some version of this, because we meant it when we said we're going to keep working on it, in Chennai next year.
Oh, that should be fascinating.
Yeah. I think
what's
that
the venue
will be
in Chennai?
a contemporary dance festival. A contemporary dance festival, and this will be very, very different from how people in India, artists today, think of contemporary Indian dance. That's a whole other complex world, right? So yeah, let's see. There will have to be certain modifications, obviously, that are made, things that will be read differently in that context, or not. I don't know, but. But yeah, that's why we want to have opportunities to do it in different settings, because the audience is a lot of the piece, and especially all of you. I mean, God, you were so close. You were just like, a few
very intense.
Feet away. But yeah.
Have you done it in the UK?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's another. Yeah. Yeah, each of the location, which is interesting to think about how so much of the piece is determined by the location and who the audience is. Even Star, like your first question, there will be certain contexts where that's not going to be a first question, what you asked, right? So a lot of it depends on that.
Are there any other questions?
Are there any other questions?
Yes.
So I get a mic?
This is a tag team.
I don't know.
Hi there, what's your name?
I'm Reed.
Hi, Reed. What's your question?
Will there ever be an ending to this piece? Because you keep saying it's in progress, but I'm wondering when do you consider it done?
Well, there's done and then there's done. We have to get through the Q&A before we get to anything. I'm going to assume now that you mean when are we finished with the process of actually, yeah, never. I don't think that's ever, it evolves. Every time we do it, we add new pieces. We have an idea of a certain length that we like to do that makes it relevant for certain kinds of venues. And so we're getting very, very close to that. So a lot of what we do depends on audience reaction, what works, what doesn't work, what's going on in the world, what's going on with us, where we're at in terms of what we want to talk about. We have great fun shaping and still talking about the shape of this particular world right now, so we're still kind of deeply invested there. But so we're close, but you know, it never ends. But we're not at the end of it yet today.
Thank you.
There's another person.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you very much. Start with that. I am kind of curious about the decision of if we're operating within space of, I don't know, a vein of Occidentalism or a vein of critiquing the Western canon and academia, Western academia. I am curious about the decision to use Kafka as a model for this, and kind of, I mean, what I loved is when you were thinking of your costume and the previous kind of using Italian designer, I don't know, that, and in my kind of, I don't know, calculating it all, it would only be that the only equation to it is that there is no other model other than the Western canon. There is no other canonical reading of it other than the Western canon. But I'm curious about your kind of meandering over finding the model for this.
Meaning with the short story?
Well, yeah, to the Academy and Kafka using him as a model for this piece, and why?
You really want to know why?
Well, I was completely engaged. I can't imagine it.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, I can't imagine any other way. I know why. I know why. But I think it's just very interesting.
I'll tell you why mostly. Because we liked the title of the short story. We liked the title and the idea of the object of study having an opportunity to speak to the studiers, right? So it was more that setup. Of course, it's a far more complicated thing than that, and especially given that it's Kafka, who Kafka is and when he's writing it. So all of those things are there. Again, comes into play the interpretation that the audience gives to this, right? Many people will not know the short story, in which case it becomes kind of irrelevant, these sorts of nuanced considerations that you're talking about. So that's the primary reason. It was more just the sort of image of apeness, shall we say. And at one point, otherness, apeness, yeah. At one point we had considered even like introducing more of this ape, sort of simian touch to it. I don't mean like putting, fur suits on or something, although I'd love to do that. Yeah. But who knows, that we might have to. You're not the only person who's asked that, of course, and I think it's something that we have to revisit. Because it is a source material, right? The short story is a source material. We actually began work on the piece, and then a friend at World Arts and Cultures, in fact, when I explained to her what we were doing, she said, oh, there's this short story. And it was then that we read the story. We were still in the middle of making the piece, and then that kind of shaped what happened. So it isn't a significant source material, but one I think that we have to think through all the more. We're also toying with versions of this, and we'll talk about that tomorrow in the graduate class, of a work that would be done in a gallery space, and then, through the course of the performance, there's a kind of configuration or installation that remains, and then the thing would be called The Remains of the Academy, something like that. Especially given this particular moment in time when the Academy is under siege. I think this whole question, and we've thought a lot about that in these weeks, this question of the critique from within the Academy and post-colonial politics and the politics of art making are different in a moment when, even the scientists, right? I mean, who question, even the scientists are under siege. Even science is under siege, not just the humanities or the social sciences. So it's a different context, I think, for the piece now.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Are there other questions?
I don't think there are any more questions.
Are there any more questions, Marc?
There are no more questions, Shanti.
Oh.
There is one more question.
Yes. Of course, absolutely. This will be the best one.
No pressure.
What's your name?
Jade.
Hi, Jade.
I guess it's kind of going off of what you just said, but I don't know everywhere that you've done this performance, but it seems like a lot of it is focusing on context and relativity, but is there an iteration of this work for a non-art or non-educational and institutional context for this work? And
who would that be?
I mean, yeah, I guess that's all there is. Also, I guess, and that was also made me think about how much of this performance right now, today, was focused, altered into an educational, institutional direction, more so than another.
Right. Yeah, thanks. Well, the piece is called To the Academy, so we definitely had academic world and academy firmly in our sights out here somewhere when we were thinking about it as it moves forward. And one of the things that Shanti was talking about just now about the piece, sort of making a different shape as an installation. And one of the things we've been thinking about is this idea of the blending of performance and design, so that the actual objects that are left on stage and the way that they're left on stage and the shape of that might form something to be taken in its own right. And then there would be sound, perhaps. One of the things that we do as a company is we have a commitment to poor theater, which means that we use we try to use as little electronic or nothing that we can't move with by ourselves. Obviously, we've asked for props and things here that we don't carry with us, but so that's one of sort of the defining aspects of the work we do. So there's that.
I think if I could
Yes.
jump in also. We've talked about that, like, can we even imagine some version of this that could be done in a, like, real stage, or, or people buying tickets? I mean, the subject matter, and who's gonna pay to go and hear about, gripes about the academy, let alone, what gets taught in a theater? I mean, I wouldn't pay even for that. So it is very much, I think, an art audience. What I really feel is what we wish to do with it, and even how it is right now, it's much more for an audience in the contemporary arts, I think I would say, than in theater. Yeah, I think, I mean, I would be kind of scared in a way to do this in a theater.
I have to disagree. I think the theatre department is precisely one of the places where this needs to be done, because that's the cold face, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you said you were scared. What are you scared of?
Well, I don't think. I mean, then this is understandable. This is human nature we're talking about. People don't like to have their authority questioned. And I find that theater departments seem to pride themselves on this thing called empathy. Like they seem to think that they have some kind of secret formula for, more progressive and happier and, more loving relationships of self and other, which certainly is not my experience of people who populate that world. And I don't think that they like to be called on that. I think there's a lot of political correctness. I think that there are not many faculty of color in theater departments. I think there's this whole thing of faculty of color, and what they do is somehow perhaps less significant to the real work, as we're saying, that gets done. So yeah, I would be a little bit afraid for those reasons. Not that that's a reason it shouldn't be done.
Afraid in a good way.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jay.
Yeah, thanks.
Are there any more questions?
I think there are no more questions.
There are no more questions. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Yeah. I actually have one more thing that I wanted to say.
I'm sorry.
Just one more thing. This is the relationship between the choreography and the improvisation. So we've told you 100 times now that this is something that we've been doing for a while. We want to have other opportunities to do it. We're continuing to work on it. And the last time we actually performed this was last summer, so the summer of 2016. And somehow as we worked on it and rehearsed to come here today, we actually expanded it considerably from its previous version. It felt different to me than when we worked on it before. And we've alluded to that a little bit, I think, in the Q&A. I want to say the facile thing to say, well, the world has changed. A lot has gone on since 2016, and it's not the same thing now. And I actually don't believe that. I think the world has been changing for a very, very long time. And I think it's more that I've changed, or my relationship to the changing world has changed in these months. And I've never been someone who, thought I was making grand interventions with my art making, or that I had, powerful political statements to make. I just made things because it was fun to make them, and also because I thought that I knew what I wanted to say. And this time around, I feel like I don't really know
what to say. I don't know what to say. And I don't know, I don't have clear anymore, or if I ever did, what art, or what theater has to say. And the other day, a colleague of mine somewhere made a comment. He made the comment that theater for the ancient Greeks was about healing. And I thought to myself, what an extraordinary comment. You know, I mean, it may very well have been about healing. I think it was also about a lot of other things too, like competitions and, you know, urban citizenship and structures of democracy, ritual, religious belief, and of course it was entertainment. A lot of it was that too. And I also thought how extraordinary the way people always have to explain and justify what they do today with reference to some primordial grand past. And then I thought, you know, how weird, because if theater is about healing, it really hasn't done a very good job. Because everyone seems very, very sick to me. And how can something be about healing when there's not even a diagnosis of why everyone is sick? And all these things were spinning in my mind when we were rehearsing, and I thought, what is the point of any of this? You know, I read the other day, and I don't want to go on and on with this, but you know, I read the other day that the permafrost is melting. And there are millions of people on the planet displaced. There are children who are soldiers. The food we eat isn't even food anymore. You know, we have these mega store. I mean, I could go on and on. People will do anything in the name of nationalism or patriotism or religion or whatever it is they want to call it. It's a very kind of dark and sick time. And I just felt to myself, what is the point of any of this? I don't really know what to say. And I'm just wondering if there is anything to say.